Do you ever struggle with composing or painting landscapes that feature buildings in them? Well, in this video, I'm going to show you how I painted this autumn scene here that features a cottage and give you some tips on how I arrange the elements within the scene. And I'll also show you how I mix some of those autumn colours. So to begin with, I'm painting on an 11" by 14" linen canvas panel. And these panels are made by SKOOL, and if you want to get some, I'll put a link in the description box below. Now the first thing I'm doing is I'm sketching out my composition, and I began with the cottage first of all, as this is the main focal area of the painting. Now I'm using oil paints here, and the brand of paints I'm using are Blue Ridge oils, and again if you want to get some, I've put a link in the description box below. And I'm sketching out my composition with burnt sienna mixed with a little pale drying gel. So prior to beginning this painting, I actually worked on the design of this in my sketchbook to arrange the elements in the scene, with the cottage being the main focal area, and I'll talk more about this during this video. But once I'd sketched out my composition, the first thing I do, and I do this with any of my paintings, is I identify where all the dark values are and the shadows. And I always paint my dark values first. Now the reason I do this is it makes it a lot easier, in my opinion, to then paint the areas in light and get the tonality of the painting correct, and also the saturation of the colours. Now I'll just go over some quick rules in landscape painting. And that's all to do with values. So values how light or dark your subject is, and generally we'll find our darkest darks and our lightest lights in the foreground, and then as landforms recede, the darks aren't as dark and the lights aren't as light. So in this case, our darkest darks are within the trees here and some of the shadows in the foreground. Now for the trees, I used a mix of ultramarine blue with a little yellow ochre, and this creates a really dark tone, and it has a green cast to it, but very dark and very low chroma or saturation. Now trees are some of the darkest values in the landscape, especially conifer trees. Now as we recede into the distance and I'm painting some of those mountain shadows there, I used a combination of ultramarine blue with burnt sienna, titanium white and a little alizarin crimson. As many hills and mountains in the landscape, they tend to have a blue cast to them, or the shadows do, as they recede into the distance. So that's what I painted for the shadows in these distant mountains. Now this is quite a dramatic scene. It was autumn. The scene is inspired by a place called Arrowtown, which is in the South Island of New Zealand, and it was an autumn day, and we'd had quite a bit of wind and rain, and the clouds were shrouding the mountains. Now the cool thing about painting these autumn scenes is you can create some really atmospheric paintings with lots of mood and drama. So great stuff. I love painting these types of landscapes. Anyway, once I'd marked in all my dark values, I then started from the furthest zone away. In this case, I don't always do this though, but I worked on the clouds first of all, after I blocked in my darks, and painted the highlights, and also painted a little bit of the sky, which is just poking through at the top. Now the main part of it that I worked on after that was painting these rusty autumn tones, especially in the foreground here, and I was using combinations of yellow ochre, alizarin crimson, titanium white, ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. Now the other thing I was doing as well was using really loose brushwork. So I was using quite big brushes for the size of the painting, even number 8 bristle flat brushes, to get some broad gestural brush marks. So I'm not worrying about detail at this stage of the painting. I just want to establish the overall tonality of the painting, so your lights and darks. That's really important because that's what's going to give the painting depth, but also establish those base colours as well. Now when adding your colours, it's important that you don't go too light to begin with. We want to hold off on our lightest tones, in fact save those until the end of the painting. And then we've got plenty of room to add lighter layers and build them up as we work through the painting. So keep your painting tonally darker during the blocking in stage. The other thing is, don't worry about detail either. We want a nice painterly artwork. So it's good to use big brushes, and then later on we can start building up the detail. Now the brand of brushes I'm using is Rosemary & Co, and if you want to get some, I've put a link in the description box below. Now we've got a variety of different colours here in this scene, but one of the things we want to make sure that we're keeping on top of is the colour harmony in the painting. And colour harmony is just where the viewer can look at your painting and it just looks really nice and the colours just all look like they're working with each other. And the way to do this is to use common colours throughout your painting. So for example, I've been using ultramarine blue and titanium white all throughout the painting. I've used it in the sky and the clouds, I've used it in the background mountains, I've used it in the trees and in the foreground. There's a lot of yellows in this painting as well, and I've used those in the foreground and in the background as well, even in those mountains. So by using all these colours, it's connecting the zones together, and as you can see on the screen here, I don't use a whole lot of colours. I've got 9 colours on my palette, so it's a relatively limited palette. So it means I'm more likely as well to be using all the colours that I do have on my palette throughout the painting. So it's just going to make everything a little more harmonious and connect all the zones together. Now then, if you're struggling with painting autumn colours, then I've made a free video which you can watch that explains how to mix general autumn colours that you'd find in the landscape. Just click the link below and I'll send it over to you. Enjoy. Now then, back to the painting, and at this point I'd completed the blocking in stage and I was now working on the modelling stage, which is where you start working on individual zones in the painting and building up the detail. So I was working on these trees behind the cottage and just starting to build up their foliage. Now with trees, you don't want to try and paint every single leaf. It's better to treat them as masses, and then perhaps at the end or later on as you work on them, start painting the suggestion of a few leaves, but you don't want to be painting every single individual leaf. That would be a nightmare. But actually doing it this way is going to actually make your trees look a lot more realistic. Now let's just talk about the composition and the arrangement of this scene. So obviously the cottage is the main focal area here. Now the most important thing is we don't have our focal area in the middle, so I've placed the cottage to the right of the centre. Also there's a lower horizon line as well, so the cottage is in the lower part of the painting. So composition is really key with paintings, and it's one of those things that's often overlooked by a lot of artists. And I've seen many good paintings that have been spoilt by bad compositions. So there's a few things that we want to avoid in composition that could disrupt the whole painting. So we don't want anything in the middle. We don't want a centered object or anything in the middle of the composition. Also, we don't want our horizon line to be in the middle either. So you either want this higher or lower. And in this case, it's a lower horizon. Then the other thing we need to keep an eye out for is repeating shapes or masses, or repeating lines or vectors, or just general things that are going to be annoying in the composition. So as I say, the cottage is the main focal area, and I've placed the tree behind it as well, which is helping to again bring the eye towards the cottage. It's also creating some contrast as well, because the tree's pretty dark and it's juxtaposed against the cottage, which is light. Now because the cottage is one of the lightest elements in the landscape, it's going to stand out a lot more, especially when juxtaposed against some of the darker elements that are behind it. There are also some other things such as the trees, which are a lot lighter, and especially autumn trees when they've turned yellow tend to be a lot lighter in value. However, this can be a really good thing, because when you juxtapose light value trees against something dark, then they're really going to stand out. So I arranged the elements around the cottage. The other thing I tried to do was to make sure that the trees weren't all on the same line either, so just moved some of the trees a little bit forward, and it's just going to create a bit of variation and a bit more interest in the painting. Now another one of the key areas in this painting is the grass in the foreground, and in general I kept the foreground relatively simple so that it kind of acts as a rest area in the painting, where you've got a lot of things going on in the middle of the painting with the cottage and the trees around it. So I didn't want the whole painting having tons of things going on there. We want some rest areas, and oftentimes the more simple the composition usually is a lot better. So it's often not about what you leave in, but what you take out. So as I say, I kept the foreground more simple, and even when it came to painting the grass, well, the last thing I wanted to do was try and paint every single blade of grass. Again, that would just be a nightmare, and it would make the painting look overworked. So I've gone sparingly with the detail in the foreground and just implied thick grass just with my flat brushes here. I also mixed up some different colours as well, so added patches of grass, green grass, as well as the straw coloured grass as well. But I kept everything darker at this stage because now, once this was dry, I was then saving my lightest lights until last. So I was painting these highlights on the grass here, and I was using a bristle dagger brush just to paint some highlights around the cottage and some of those other trees, which is going to help draw the viewer's eye towards the main focal area as this patch of light is illuminating the area around the cottage. Now at this point in the painting it was virtually finished, and I just added some more colours and textures to the foreground, but keeping in mind the values, so how light or dark it is. I wanted everything to be a bit more muted and darker in the foreground, but also with some pockets of more saturated colour, which I did with the green grass here. And then I also just restated some dark shadows in general. And with that, the painting was complete. So I hope you enjoyed this autumn scene, and if you'd like to learn more about painting autumn colours, check out this video here. Don't forget to get your free video on mixing autumn colours, and also if you'd like a further deep dive into painting and help with your painting techniques, then come and join my live classes at my art school. I've put a link in the description box below. Thanks for watching and happy painting.